Hi, and welcome to another episode of This Week in Fake News. I'm your host, Candice Malcolm, and this is a podcast where I go through and examine some of the most biased, the most torqued, and sometimes the most flat-out fake news in Canada from the Canadian media. We all know the mainstream media is super biased, especially the state-run CBC. They all lean left. They all probably vote for like the most left-wing party in every election, and things are just so much worse now that the Trudeau government has created a fund, a bribe for the mainstream media, a bailout fund, $600 million, and that is in addition to the over $1 billion that they give to the CBC each year. So Canada's media is very biased, and this is a show where we just go through some of the worst examples of this bias. And so now we're in a full-on election, and because there's an election, we're going to see a lot more of this fake news. Journalists are really stepping it up. They do not want Conservatives to win an election. They want the Liberals to win because they want to continue getting their bailout, and because they all just like Liberal policies. They all kind of grew up in the same bubbles, and they really believe in big government, and they think that if you disagree with them on immigration, for instance, it's because you're a bad person and you're probably racist. So here, let's look at a couple of bad examples from the CBC. This was just a very biased headline that I found. This is from Katie Simpson at the CBC. She says, "New from me, Conservative leader Andrew Scheer will stand by candidates who make racist, homophobic remarks in the past, as long as they apologize and take responsibility for their words." Now, when I saw that headline, I honestly thought it was like either clickbait from like a far left activist group, like a third party group, or maybe like a fake media organization like Press Progress. No, it's from the CBC, which is supposed to be the objective mainstream media outlet. There's so many problems with this headline and with the story itself. But first of all, you can't make a racist and a homophobic remark in the past. You can't have a present tense of a word and then have the word in the past. So she wants to make it seem like the candidates today are actively racist and homophobic, when in reality what's happened here, I went through this on the last podcast, because there's an election, because it's 2019, and our world is just so uptight, so politically correct, and there's this censorship mob of people who just absolutely have no sense of humor, and they want to punish anyone who's ever made an unsavory comment in their entire life. You have them combing through people's pasts. Any kind of public comment that they've ever made on social media is picked apart and thrown up as an example of how horrible a political party is. And it's not just happening to Conservatives. As I talked about last week, there's been candidates from the Liberals, the Greens, the NDP, and the Conservatives who have all either been removed from their position or been sort of reprimanded and scolded over past comments. The comments that they're talking about here from the Conservatives, was a guy who made some stupid remarks when he was a teenager on social media. He used a derogatory term, and he quickly apologized and just said, that's not who I am today. Scheer accepted that, but according to the CBC, that's just totally unacceptable, and they really make it seem like it's really a distinctly conservative problem, as if Conservatives just had a whole bunch of racist and homophobic candidates out there, and hey, Andrew Scheer is just totally okay with it so long as they apologize afterwards. It's just super dishonest and such a yucky way of conducting journalism. And honestly, the fact that this headline even passed an editor is shocking. They don't make any reference to the fact that that NDP leader Jagmeet Singh virtually said the exact same thing about his candidates. There's a Liberal candidate who made very anti-Semitic comments in the past, and he claimed that the Liberals knew about those comments. Again, it's happening to everyone. It's just the state of the world in 2019 that there's a mob of censorship. And to make it seem like it's a uniquely conservative problem is just really gross. This is pretty funny. Trudeau, I think he's bribing a CBC reporter. This is all really funny. So Trudeau's on the campaign trail. He's refusing to answer questions because he really doesn't have any leg to stand on when it comes to defending his horrible record. He's just, up to the eyeballs in scandals, and he can't articulate or explain away the issues without lying. And so it's better for the Liberals to just not have him speak at all. Pretty face, photogenic. Let's just have him do these photo ops. So this is at a photo op where journalists are told not to ask questions, and those dutiful mainstream media reporters have just fallen in line, and they're not asking any questions of the Prime Minister. They're just laughing and joking around. And here you see a CBC reporter becoming part of the photo op. Here's a clip.
For you, David. This is for you. No, not me. Hey, Liberal Party always supports the city.
Oh, who's going to take it?
Okay, So there's just so much wrong with that. Trudeau's kind of like openly joking around and bribing that's a CBC journalist right there. And by chance, this is the same guy who has been on Twitter defending the Trudeau Liberals. When I first saw his Twitter feed, I actually thought he was maybe a spokesperson for the Liberal Party. And I'm not saying that to like as a dig against him. I actually did think that he was some kind of a spokesperson because I wasn't really familiar with who he was. But when you read the remarks and how he's justifying why Trudeau is refusing to take questions, it just really comes across as a justification, and that's really not the job of a reporter, especially someone who's on the campaign there to ask Justin Trudeau questions and to try to hold him responsible and accountable, and so Canadians can see who this person is. You know, the job of a reporter really isn't to joke and laugh and be part of a photo op for the Liberal Party of Canada, but that's what we have right there, and honestly, it looks like a bribe to me. It's pretty pathetic, and that shows just kind of like the close relationship that Liberals have with the CBC. And hey, I mean, if I was a Liberal and the CBC gave me glowing coverage and anytime there was a scandal, they try to change the channel and they spent 4 years just absolutely promoting my agenda, glossing over anything bad that I did and shrugging off corruption scandals, shrugging off terrorist allegations or Trudeau being close to several different terrorists, you know, if I was a Liberal and the CBC treated me that way, I'd love the CBC too, and I'd probably, you know, buy the guy poutine too. So that's, I guess, well-deserved and really just a microcosm that shows how bad the situation is in Canada when you have so many journalists that are personally indebted and absolutely in love with Justin Trudeau. Okay, now there's one story that I really want to go through because it absolutely drives me crazy. This is definitely the worst example of fake news in the news this week, and no, it's not from CBC, it's not from the Toronto Star, it's from Global. Global is usually pretty good. Global is usually, you know, fair, centrist, down the middle. They don't obviously have a bias one way or another, and they have some pretty good investigative journalists and writers who do stuff on national security and immigration. So this was particularly disappointing to see. This came out at the end of last week after the debate. So there was the first leaders debate last Thursday, and Justin Trudeau didn't show up. So it was just Andrew Scheer from the Conservatives, Elizabeth May from the Greens, and NDP's Jagmeet Singh. They talked about a whole bunch of issues. They didn't talk about immigration. They barely talked about immigration. There's no questions on immigration, even though about 20% of Canadians say that they think that that's a top issue in this election. But there was one minute of a 2-hour debate, 1 minute of it the conversation went to immigration. They talked about it a little bit. The question was about Brexit, but then somehow it shifted and they started talking about immigration. It was basically just the two left-wing leaders accusing the Conservatives of being racist, which is what they always do. It's like the only line that they have. And at one point, Andrew Scheer talks about how these illegal immigrants, people who cross the border illegally, are jumping the queue. They cross the border illegally, they make an asylum claim, so they're no longer illegal immigrants, they're now asylum seekers who are waiting to be ruled upon to see whether or not they are a refugee. Only about half of them, it turns out, are refugees. The other half either have to either abandon their claims or they get rejected by an immigration judge. And so Andrew Scheer correctly said that these people are jumping the queue of our immigration system and our refugee system. He says that Conservatives believe in orderly immigration that has to be according to the laws, and that people who come in illegally are jumping the queue. And then Elizabeth May, the Green Party leader, just says there is no queue. She says there is no queue. Let's just show this clip. We've got the clip here.
There's nothing compassionate about forcing people to wait longer who are in refugee camps in places where there is civil war, where they will be killed if they leave those camps, where they have to wait longer because some people are skipping the line and jumping the queue and coming into Canada.
There's no queue for refugees. There is no queue for refugees.
Okay. So first, it is Elizabeth May that is incorrect. She says that there is no queue for refugees. That's totally wrong. That's totally wrong. How do you think that refugees get picked to come to Canada? They don't just it's not like every year every single refugee who wants to come to Canada gets to go. There are about 4 million refugees around the world. There is a system through the United Nations where they register with the UN and then they wait. They either live in refugee camps or they go live somewhere else and they wait for the UN to call their name to basically get through the queue, and then they get resettled to a different country, to a Western country. Most of the time it's not Canada. They get resettled to countries nearby the conflict zone that they're fleeing. And then a couple of them, like a small percentage of them, get to go to either Canada, the US, Australia, or New Zealand or England, or a couple other countries that receive refugees. So there is obviously a queue. There is obviously a queue, but crazy Elizabeth May, who doesn't know anything, just shouts out that Andrew Scheer acts as if people are illegals, which calling illegal immigrants illegals is very derogatory, and Scheer doesn't do that, but Elizabeth May literally just did in that exchange. And then she says that there is no queue for refugees. So I wrote a column after that saying that Elizabeth May was completely wrong. There are at least 3 different distinct queues when it comes to refugees. There's that UN one I just talked about. There's also the queue that people wait in when they're waiting to have their case heard. So right now, because there's been so much illegal immigration under Justin Trudeau, there is about 77,000 people waiting in that queue to have their case process. It takes between 2 to 5 years, can take up to 11 years to have your case fully decided on. And in that time, people are in limbo. They can't really leave. They don't know where they stand. It's hard to set down roots if you don't know whether your case is going to be accepted or not. So because there are so many illegal immigrants and so many people who aren't bona fide refugees, who are just opportunists, basically, they create a longer queue for the people who are actually fleeing violence and persecution. That's the second queue. The third queue is these refugee resettlement organizations. They get taxpayer dollars, and their job is to help newcomers get used to life in Canada. They help them integrate from very basic things like learning how to use the bus, learning how to pay bills in Canada, how to open up a bank account, to more complex things like learning how to speak English, learning skills and trying to get a job, trying to find a place to live, getting kids into school, all that kind of stuff. It's really important. But these refugee resettlement organizations have very limited budgets and limited resources. Canada accepts about 50,000 refugees from the UN every year, and those refugee resettlement organizations are supposed to help those people. But then they also have to help the asylum seekers, and because they have limited resources, people have to wait for the services. So you have people waiting in Canada in a queue to get resettlement services, to get into English classes, and they can't because there's such a long queue because of all the illegal immigration. So there are several queues. This is all just to say there are several queues, multiple queues that people wait in when it comes to immigration. Now, you wouldn't know that if you were just reading the mainstream media. If you're reading this terrible global piece, here it is, the headline right here. It says, "Reality check, Scheer's claim about refugees jumping the queue is false." Okay, it was Elizabeth May who made the false claim. Scheer was correct, but not according to this idiotic report. Asylum seekers who show up at Canada's borders, including irregular border crossers, that's such an awkward way to say it, irregular border crossers, are not jumping the queue, as Conservative leader Andrew Scheer suggests in Thursday night's debate. In fact, there is no queue. Okay, so basically this reporter has found one activist, and she has said the exact opposite is what is true. So he's relying on this one person who he claims is an expert. He says the problem with the logic is that there are 2 systems in which Scheer referred. One in which people make claim at the border or after living in Canada, and another in which refugees are resettled in Canada after being processed overseas by the UN. They are 2 completely different systems and have no direct or explicit links, experts say. That's like the favorite line from journalists. They're just so lazy. They find one left-wing activist, and then they take what that person says and they say experts say. Well, this piece only interviewed one person, so you can't say experts plural. At least just say an expert says. And second of all, anyone who claims to be an expert in immigration is probably just self-promoting and self-inflating their own understanding. So here we have a professor from the University of Ottawa, Christina Clark-Kazak. She says, just like Elizabeth May, there is no queue. Wow, I wonder what party she votes for. She says, so this is problematic to be using this language. Under international law, people have the right to make an asylum. Okay, there's 2 things wrong with this. The first one is that there is only one system, there's only one type of refugees, it's under international law, the definitions are the same. That 2 systems that she's talking about that she says have no direct or explicit links. That's completely wrong. Look at Australia's system, okay? Australia also gets a lot of asylum seekers, but they don't want people to make the dangerous and risky trek overseas to get on a boat and come to Australia. So they do as much as they can to deter it. And if someone is intercepted or someone lands in Australia, makes an asylum claim, they go to a specific island. They don't even get to come into Australia. They go to an island where they wait to have their claim processed. If the claim is successful and the person is deemed to be a refugee, they don't then get to come into Australia. They go to the United Nations and then they get processed through that same queue. So they basically go to the back of the queue. Whereas in Canada, when we accept someone's refugee claim, they automatically get to come into Canada. So they are jumping the queue. It's the same system. It's the same definition of a refugee. It's wrong to say that we have two different systems. And then this claim here where she says that people have the right to make an asylum under international law, that is not true. That is not true. People do not have the right to make an asylum claim in Canada. In fact, international law says that a person has to make their asylum claim in the first safe country they arrive in. So all of the people, every single one of them who is walking into Canada illegally is coming from the United States, which is a safe country. Under international law, they have to make their claim in that country, in the United States. So this person is wrong. This person is wrong, but Global just calls up one person, one left-wing activist, and then claims to have the complete truth and know everything there is about immigration, and then they rule as a fact that it is Andrew Scheer that is wrong when they're completely backwards. It is Elizabeth May that's wrong. Now, perhaps the worst part of this idiotic story is this dumb reporter calls up the Conservative Party and says, a spokesperson for the Conservative spokesperson did not respond directly to questions about whether Scheer knew his claim about queue jumping was inaccurate. So the reporter calls up Scheer and says, hey, did you know your claim is inaccurate? And then instead of the spokesperson for the Conservatives saying, no, it's actually you that's wrong, Scheer's claim was right, they just didn't respond directly to that question. So it's kind of sad that Conservatives are afraid of their own shadow and they won't just outright say what is true. Scheer did it in the debate. His communications spokespeople are too afraid of their own shadow, so they were unwilling to tell the stupid Global reporter where to shove it, and that it is him that is wrong and not Scheer. Instead, the spokesperson did, however, say crossing the border in between a point of entry is illegal. I love that he puts scare quotes over the term illegal, even though it's obviously illegal to cross the border illegally. And he says, and that resources should be spent on the most vulnerable, not on those who make it to a safe country like the United States. Okay, this is just brutal. Such a bad report. It's pathetic. It shows, you know what? This is what $600 million in a government bailout gets you. This is exactly what the United Nations Compact on Migration said, that it was going to basically force journalists to write positive stories about migrants and get rid of the negative ones. And I mean, this one just bends the truth, and they use flat out lies to tell Canadians that the opposite of what is true is true. It's a sad state of affairs, especially Global, who's usually pretty good on this kind of stuff. Okay, guys, I'm going to leave it at that for this week. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'll be back next week. It's the election, so you know there's going to be a lot of biased news out there. Thanks so much for tuning in. Don't forget to like this video, share this video, and if you want to see more from True North, check out our website, tnc.news. Thank you so much.